I flew 10 grueling hours across the Atlantic to attend my sister's wedding, clutching a custom gift I spent months acquiring. But when I reached the gates of the hyper-luxurious Malibu resort, security blocked my path. My parents marched out, and my mother looked me dead in the eye. "Only family is allowed," she sneered. "You are not invited. Leave." Heartbroken and humiliated, I walked away. 3 days later, my mother called me in an absolute panic. "The wedding bill is $45,000, and I put your name down to pay it," she demanded. What she did not know was that I was about to teach her a very expensive lesson. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever felt abandoned by the people who should have protected you. I am Clara, 34 years old, and I spent my entire life playing the role of the family disappointment. The California sun was blinding as my rideshare pulled up to the towering iron gates of the Grand Azure Estate in Malibu. I had just stepped off a 10-hour flight from London, my body aching from travel, my internal clock completely scrambled. But I pushed the exhaustion down. Today was supposed to be a celebration. My younger sister Brittany was getting married. I held a heavy custom-engraved crystal sculpture in my lap, a gift I had commissioned specifically for her and her new husband, Malik. The estate was breathtaking. Ocean waves crashed against the cliffs in the distance, and the manicured lawn stretched out like a green carpet toward the main reception hall. I smoothed down my dress, took a deep breath of the salty air, and walked toward the opulent entrance. Two men in dark suits stepped seamlessly into my path, their expressions identical masks of professional indifference. "May I have your name, miss?" the taller guard asked, holding a digital tablet. "Clara," I said, offering a tired but polite smile. "I am the bride's sister." The guard scrolled through his screen, his brow furrowed. "I am sorry, miss. I do not have a Clara on the approved guest list." I let out a small laugh, assuming there had been a simple clerical error. "There must be a mistake," I insisted. "I am the sister of the bride. Could you perhaps check with the wedding planner?" The guard did not move. He raised his radio to his shoulder and muttered a few words I could not catch over the sound of the fountain splashing nearby. Less than 2 minutes later, the heavy oak doors of the venue swung open. My heart leapt, expecting to see a frantic wedding coordinator rushing out to apologize for the mix-up. Instead, my mother Patricia and my father William marched out onto the cobblestone driveway. My mother wore an incredibly expensive silver gown, her hair styled to absolute perfection. My father looked equally polished in a tailored tuxedo, but there was no warmth in their eyes, no relief at seeing me safely arrived. They looked at me as if I were a trespasser attempting to ruin their perfect day. "Mom. Dad." I started stepping forward with the gift box. "Security says my name is not on the list. There must have been a typo." My mother stopped a few feet away from me. Her gaze swept over me, taking in my travel-wrinkled clothes, my tired face, and the box in my hands. Her lip curled upward in a sneer of pure disdain. "There is no typo, Clara." Patricia said, her voice sharp and devoid of any maternal affection. "You are not on the list because you were not invited." The words hit me like a physical blow. The heavy crystal gift in my arms suddenly felt like a boulder pulling me toward the ground. I stared at them, my mind struggling to process the cruelty of the statement. "I flew all the way from London," I managed to say, my voice trembling slightly. "This is my sister's wedding. I am family." My father finally spoke, his tone dripping with condescension. "You are a biological relative, Clara, but today is about supporting Brittany. We cannot risk you creating an awkward situation in front of Malik's family." I felt the familiar suffocating weight of their lifelong judgment settling over my shoulders. For as long as I could remember, I had been the black sheep. While Brittany spent her 20s hunting for a wealthy husband to secure her status, I had poured my energy into building my own business from the ground up. My parents never understood my ambition. To them, my late nights and financial struggles during my 20s were signs of failure, not dedication. They worshipped the appearance of wealth and because I did not flash designer bags or drive a leased sports car, they deemed my life completely mediocre. My mother stepped closer, lowering her voice so the security guards would not overhear the ugly details of her insult. "Look at yourself, Clara," she hissed. "You look exhausted and entirely out of place." Malik comes from a highly respected, deeply intellectual family. They are doctors and architects. We are hosting a high society event, and frankly, you are socially unfit for this crowd. I tightened my grip on the gift box. Socially unfit, I repeated, the sheer absurdity of the accusation wrapping around my throat. Patricia rolled her eyes, gesturing dismissively toward my practical shoes and unstyled hair. "We cannot have you embarrassing us by talking about your little startup projects," she continued mercilessly. "You chose to play small-time business owner instead of securing a proper future for yourself. Brittany is marrying into real money today. We will not let your presence drag down our family image." Her words were a knife twisting in a very old wound. The absolute hypocrisy of her statement made my blood boil. Just 4 years ago, when their reckless spending put them on the brink of financial ruin, I was the one working multiple jobs to bail them out. I had drained my savings to pay off their massive credit card debt simply because I believed that family took care of family. They had gladly taken my money, then happy to use my hard-earned cash while continuing to coddle Brittany. Yet here they were, standing in front of a luxury resort, treating me like a peasant who had wandered onto their private estate. I looked at my father, hoping for a shred of defense, but he simply adjusted his cuffs and nodded in agreement with my mother. "You should have planned better," Clara Williams stated coldly. "If you wanted to be included in elite family events, you should have built a life worthy of them. Now please leave before you cause a scene and ruin your sister's special day." Before I could even formulate a response to my father's incredibly callous dismissal, the massive oak doors of the grand entrance groaned open once more. A hush fell over my parents as they quickly stepped aside their harsh glares, instantly softening into expressions of pure adoration. I turned my head, my eyes adjusting to the bright midday sun reflecting off the polished marble courtyard. Stepping out from the cool shadows of the reception hall was my sister Brittany. She was a vision of manufactured perfection, draped in a gown that I instantly recognized from an exclusive bridal boutique in Beverly Hills. It was a spectacular creation of imported French lace and hand-sewn pearls, a dress with a price tag easily sitting around $15,000. The sheer extravagance of it was staggering, especially knowing that my parents were currently drowning in second mortgages and credit card debt just to keep up appearances. Brittany paused at the top of the stone steps. Her blonde hair was swept up into an immaculate updo, and her makeup was flawless, designed to make her look like old money royalty. But the moment her eyes locked onto mine, that carefully crafted facade of a blushing, elegant bride vanished entirely. Her face twisted into a mask of pure malice. She did not look at me with the surprise of a sister seeing a sibling who had flown across the globe for her. She looked at me like I was a piece of trash that had somehow blown onto her pristine lawn. "What is she doing here?" Brittany snapped, her voice sharp and grating, completely shattering the serene atmosphere of the luxury resort. She hiked up the skirt of her incredibly expensive gown and marched down the steps toward us. "I told you both to make sure the perimeter was secure. Why is she standing at my venue?" I tightened my grip on the heavy crystal gift box in my hands. "Brittany, I flew 10 hours. I began, trying to keep my voice level despite the crushing weight in my chest. "I came here to celebrate your wedding." "Celebrate?" Brittany scoffed, letting out a harsh, mocking laugh that echoed off the stone walls. "Please, Clara. You came here to make a scene and drag down the aesthetic of my entire event." She crossed her arms, her eyes raking over my practical travel clothes and sensible shoes with absolute disgust. "I can't have my new in-laws seeing my sister looking like a struggling startup failure. This is a high society event. The people inside that ballroom are industry leaders, wealth managers, and socialites. You do not belong here. You look like you belong in a cubicle." Her words were designed to humiliate, to put me back in the box they had constructed for me years ago. In their minds, because I had chosen to grind away at my own business ventures, instead of relying on family handouts or marrying a rich man, I was a tragic failure. They had no idea about the massive success I had quietly built, and Brittany was entirely convinced that her least luxury made her vastly superior to my quiet dedication. Before I could unleash the fury bubbling in my throat, the heavy oak doors swung open again. A tall, strikingly handsome African-American man stepped out into the sunlight. This was Malik, the groom. Even from a distance, he exuded a quiet, commanding authority. At 31 years old, Malik was already a highly successful architect, known not just for his brilliant structural designs, but for his fierce, uncompromising principles. He adjusted his tailored suit jacket, his intelligent eyes immediately taking in the tense standoff happening on the driveway. "Brittany, is everything all right out here?" Malik asked, his deep voice carrying easily across the courtyard. He walked down the steps, his gaze shifting from my parents' rigid posture to my exhausted face. "Who is this?" The transformation in my sister was terrifyingly instantaneous. The cruel, sneering woman who had just called me a struggling failure disappeared in a fraction of a second. Brittany's shoulders slumped. She let out a soft, trembling gasp and immediately rushed over to Malik, throwing her arms around his waist and burying her face in his chest. She engineered a perfectly fragile, victimized persona right before my eyes. "It is nobody, sweetheart," Brittany whimpered, her voice suddenly high and fragile, dripping with fake distress. "It is just someone trying to cause trouble. My parents are handling it. Please let us just go back inside. She is upsetting me on our special day." Malik looked confused, his brow furrowed as he gently wrapped an arm around Brittany, but his sharp eyes remained fixed on me. He was clearly a man who paid attention to details, and he could tell something was deeply wrong. He took a step forward, perhaps to introduce himself or ask me directly what was happening, but my parents immediately jumped into action to shield their golden child's lies. My father physically stepped between Malik and me, blocking his line of sight. "It is under control," Malik Williams said, his voice entirely too loud and falsely jovial. "Just a misunderstanding with a disgruntled vendor. Please take Brittany back to the bridal suite. She needs to remain calm before the ceremony." My mother flanked Brittany on the other side, rubbing her arms soothingly while shooting me a glare so toxic it could have withered grass. "We have security handling the trespasser," Patricia added, her voice sickly sweet for Malik's benefit. "Go inside, darling." I stood there watching this grotesque performance unfold. Malik hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but Brittany tugged urgently at his lapels, feigning a small sob. Reluctantly, he turned and guided his weeping bride back through the massive doors, completely unaware that he had just been manipulated into ignoring his own sister-in-law. The heavy doors clicked shut, leaving me alone on the cobblestones with my parents. The silence that followed was suffocating. Patricia and William turned back to me, dropping their fake smiles, their faces hardening back into masks of cold rejection. I waited for the tears to come. I waited for the familiar urge to beg for their love, to plead for my rightful place in this family. I had spent 34 years seeking their approval, sacrificing my own peace to make them happy. But as I looked at their smug, dismissive faces, something inside me simply clicked into place. The overwhelming grief that had choked me moments ago instantly evaporated, replaced by an absolute freezing calm. I looked past them, my eyes tracing the elegant architecture of the sprawling resort. I looked at the imported marble, the towering palm trees, the pristine valet station. It was an extravagant, hyper-luxurious venue, a venue that, unbeknownst to the two arrogant people standing in front of me, I legally owned. I did not cry. I did not yell. I adjusted my grip on my bag, my posture perfectly straight. I looked my mother directly in the eyes and offered a slow, cryptic, icy smile that made her flinch. "Enjoy your day," I said, my voice eerily steady and ringing with absolute certainty. "It is the last one you will have." Without waiting for their response, I turned my back on them and walked purposefully toward the waiting rideshare vehicle. I climbed into the back seat, closed the door, and told the driver to take me back to Los Angeles. I did not look back at the gates because I already knew exactly how I was going to tear their fake, perfectly curated world to shreds. The rideshare merged onto the Pacific Coast Highway, leaving the sprawling grounds of the Grand Azure Estate behind us. I watched the ocean blur into a continuous ribbon of blue. The heavy, suffocating knot of rejection that had lived in my chest for over 3 decades was finally gone. In its place, a sharp, crystalline focus took hold. For years, I had analyzed my family dynamic through the lens of a hopeful, desperate child. I had searched for the missing puzzle piece that would finally earn my parents' affection. I had bent over backward to accommodate their ridiculous standards. But as the miles of California coastline rolled by, the final piece of the puzzle snapped into place. It was never about me being a disappointment. It was about me refusing to be their personal ATM for Brittany's delusions of grandeur. My mind drifted back 4 years to a rainy Tuesday evening. My father had called me, his voice shaking, admitting they were 60 days away from losing their suburban home to foreclosure. They had leveraged their property to the absolute limit, taking out a massive second mortgage just to pay for Brittany's luxury cars, designer wardrobes, and European vacations. They had funded her fake socialite lifestyle until the bank finally came knocking with eviction notices. I had not been a struggling startup failure back then either. I had already sold my first tech venture for a comfortable 8 figures. But I knew my parents. If they knew the extent of my actual wealth, they would drain me dry. So I played the part of the diligent, modest worker who had scraped together just enough to save them from ruin. I paid off their entire mortgage. Hundreds of thousands of dollars wiped out with a single wire transfer. I thought that would be enough. I thought saving the roof over their heads would finally earn me a seat at the family dinner table. Instead, the moment the ink dried on the bank release forms, my mother complained that I had not offered to pay for Brittany's upcoming trip to Milan. When I firmly refused to fund my sister's extravagant vacations, I instantly reverted to being the selfish, mediocre disappointment. They took my money, saved their house, and then punished me for closing the vault. They genuinely believed I was a mid-level employee, grinding away in obscurity, because that was the narrative they needed to justify my refusal to finance Brittany's life. They needed me to be a failure so they could feel justified in casting me aside. As the driver navigated the winding coastal roads toward Los Angeles, a cold, calculated silence settled over my thoughts. I was not angry anymore. Anger is a hot, chaotic emotion that leads to mistakes. What I felt was absolute chilling clarity. They had weaponized my supposed poverty to humiliate me in front of Malik. They had barred me from a venue I actually owned. They had pushed me out to protect a facade built entirely on lies. It was time to pull the curtain down on their entire performance. I reached into my bag and pulled out my secondary phone, a highly secured device I kept strictly for top-level corporate communications. The screen illuminated, displaying pending messages from board members and international investment partners. I bypassed them all and opened a direct encrypted chat with my chief financial officer at Apex Hospitality Group. Apex was the massive venture capital firm I had founded, a corporate titan that specialized in quietly acquiring distressed luxury properties, reorganizing their debt, and turning them into highly profitable resorts. The Grand Azure Estate had been my crown jewel acquisition 8 months ago. I had bought the entire property, the grounds, the vendor contracts, the very cobblestones my parents had just stood on, in a completely silent buyout. Legally, every blade of grass at that venue belonged to my corporation. I typed a single, precise message to my executive team. Flag the wedding reception currently taking place at the Grand Azure. Put a hard hold on the final billing protocol. Do not process any automatic payments. I want the complete financial file and the signed guarantor contract on my desk first thing Monday morning. The response came back less than a minute later. A simple confirmation. Considered it done. I locked the screen and slipped the phone back into my bag. I was no longer Clara, the rejected, socially unfit sister. I was Clara, the chief executive officer, and I was about to execute a hostile takeover of my own family. The rideshare pulled up to the sleek, towering high-rise in downtown Los Angeles. A uniformed valet opened my door, greeting me with a respectful nod as I stepped out into the warm evening air. I bypassed the main lobby and took the private access elevator directly to the top floor. The steel doors slid open silently, revealing my massive penthouse. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking, unobstructed view of the city skyline, the sprawling urban grid glittering under the fading afternoon sun. The space was a testament to the empire I had built quietly and ruthlessly. Custom Italian furniture, museum-quality artwork, and the absolute pristine silence of a fortress high above the chaos of the world. This was the reality my family knew nothing about. I walked across the polished hardwood floors, dropping my keys onto the marble entryway table. I did not bother unpacking my suitcase or taking off my travel coat. I walked straight to the custom bar cart, positioned near the massive windows. My hands were perfectly steady as I reached for a crystal decanter. I poured 2 fingers of aged bourbon into a heavy glass, watching the amber liquid catch the light of the setting sun. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the heat of the bourbon warm my throat. I looked out over the sprawling city, imagining the extravagant, fraudulent wedding reception currently taking place on my property, miles away. I raised my glass slightly toward the horizon in a mock toast. "Let them enjoy the party," I said out loud, my voice echoing in the quiet penthouse. "The bill comes Monday." 72 hours later, the brutal reality of a Monday morning settled over Los Angeles. I stood at the head of the massive obsidian conference table in the executive boardroom of Apex Hospitality Group. The morning sun streamed through the panoramic windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. This was my sanctuary. This was the empire I had built from the ground up. To my parents, I was just a struggling, misguided woman playing at business. To the corporate world, I was the sole founder, chief executive officer, and 100% owner of a venture capital firm that managed over $2 billion in assets. Apex Hospitality Group specialized in identifying distressed luxury properties, executing silent buyouts, restructuring their massive debts, and turning them into incredibly profitable ventures. The Grand Azure Estate in Malibu was my most recent acquisition. 8 months ago, the previous owners had quietly gone bankrupt. I swooped in, purchased the entire property outright through a maze of shell companies to keep the acquisition out of the press, and injected $10 million into its renovation. Every single employee at that venue ultimately answered to me, the phantom owner who operated strictly from the shadows. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the bustling city below. I had spent the last 3 days completely unplugged from my personal life. My phone had remained entirely silent. No frantic apologies from my parents. No angry messages from Brittany. They had successfully discarded me entirely, focused on celebrating a wedding built on a foundation of financial lies. They were likely still basking in the glow of their fake high society triumph, completely oblivious to the ticking time bomb they had planted under their own feet. The heavy glass door of the boardroom swung open. Carter, my chief financial officer, stepped into the room. Carter was a brilliant, meticulous man who handled the intricate web of accounts that kept Apex functioning flawlessly. Usually he carried an air of absolute calm, but today his brow was furrowed, and he held a thick manila folder tightly against his chest. "Clara, we have an urgent situation that requires your immediate attention," Carter said, closing the door firmly behind him to ensure privacy. I turned away from the window. "Tell me," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "Is it regarding the European acquisitions?" "No," Carter replied, placing the folder directly in front of me. "It is regarding the Grand Azure Estate in Malibu. The venue reported a critical billing failure this morning. Our automated accounting systems flagged it at dawn, and the property manager escalated it directly to my office because of the sheer size of the default. Apex had strict protocols for events hosted at our properties. Every client was required to submit a non-refundable deposit up front, followed by a final payment processed exactly 48 hours after the event concluded. We hosted a highly publicized wedding reception at the estate on Saturday evening. Carter continued opening the folder to reveal a stack of financial documents and bank rejection notices. The total cost of the event came to exactly $45,000. The client provided a secondary bank account for the final automated draft. When our system attempted to pull the funds this morning, the transaction was completely rejected. The bank reported the account has been overdrawn for weeks. I slowly opened the file, my eyes scanning the crisp text on the corporate letterhead. Who are the primary clients listed on the defaulted contract? I asked, feigning professional curiosity. Carter tapped his finger against the top page. Patricia and William, the parents of the bride. They signed the initial contract and paid the minimum booking deposit 6 months ago. However, due to their consistently poor credit history and a lack of verifiable liquid assets, our risk assessment software initially rejected their application to host such an expensive event at the Grand Azur. They were told they needed a qualified guarantor to secure the booking, and they found one. I prompted, turning to the next page in the file. Yes, Carter said, his voice dropping an octave, a note of genuine concern bleeding into his professional tone. That is why I brought this directly to you instead of sending it to the legal department. You need to look at the guarantor signature on the final page of that contract. I flipped to the back of the heavy legal document. There, printed in bold ink, was the financial guarantee agreement. It stated clearly that if the primary clients failed to pay the $45,000 balance, the guarantor would be held entirely responsible, subjecting them to immediate wage garnishment, asset seizure, and severe credit penalties. Below the harsh legal warnings was a signature. My signature. I stared at the looping letters of my own name, perfectly mimicked in blue ink. Below the signature was my personal cell phone number, my private residential address, and my full, highly confidential social security number. The absolute audacity of it was breathtaking. Patricia and William had not just bounced a check. They had weaponized my identity to steal $45,000 from my own corporation. Carter watched me closely. Clara, that is your social security number, he said quietly. But the property manager confirmed that you were not present when this contract was executed. Whoever signed this document committed felony identity theft to secure a luxury wedding venue. They essentially stole $45,000 from Apex Hospitality Group, and they used your identity as the shield. I closed the folder, running my hand over the smooth manila cover. The sheer terrifying reality of my parents' actions settled over the room. They had assumed I was a struggling mid-level employee working somewhere within the vast corporate structure of the Grand Azur. They believed that by forging my name as the guarantor, I would be forced to quietly pay the debt or risk being fired by my superiors. They thought they had trapped me in a corner, forcing me to finance Brittany's extravagant fairy tale under the threat of my own professional ruin. They had absolutely no clue that the superior they thought they were dealing with was the very daughter they had thrown out like garbage. Prepare a full legal brief, I told Carter, my voice ringing with icy authority. Contact the bank and get official records of the bounced transaction. Then pull every piece of security footage from the Malibu estate showing Patricia and William executing this contract. We are going to process this exactly by the book. Carter nodded, picking up the folder. Are we sending this to our collections department? No, I replied, a slow, cold smile spreading across my face. Send it directly to my personal attorney. We are not just going to collect a debt. We are going to prosecute them to the fullest extent of the law. As the heavy glass door clicked shut behind Carter, the absolute silence of the boardroom settled around me. I walked back to the head of the obsidian table and sat down in my high-backed leather chair. I opened my encrypted laptop, my fingers flying across the keyboard to access the secure internal server of Apex Hospitality Group. I needed to see the digital files for myself, to look at the exact digital footprint my parents had left behind. Carter had instantly uploaded the scanned documents to my private dashboard. I clicked on the file labeled The Grand Azure Estate Wedding Dispute and watched as the high-resolution images of the contract filled my screen. My eyes scanned the elegant typography of my own company's standard rental agreement. It detailed the lavish choices Brittany and my mother had made. The imported white orchids, the five-course plated dinner featuring Wagyu beef and butter-poached lobster, the top-tier open bar that had served premium vintage champagne until 2 in the morning. Every single luxury they had flaunted in front of Malik's dignified family was meticulously itemized, accompanied by exorbitant price tags that ultimately totaled exactly $45,000. I scrolled past the invoice breakdown and navigated straight to the final pages to the legal liability section. I zoomed in on the digital scan, the pixels sharpening, to reveal the heavy blue ink of the physical document. There it was. My name, Clara, printed in my mother's unmistakable, slightly slanted handwriting. She had listed my title as event coordinator, a completely fabricated mid-level position she assumed I held. Beside it was my personal cell phone number and my home address. But what made the blood freeze in my veins was the 9-digit sequence written in the box reserved for the financial guarantor, my complete social security number. Seeing those 9 numbers laid out so casually on a fraudulent contract triggered a visceral reaction, instantly pulling me back to a sterile, brightly lit hospital waiting room 4 years ago. My father had collapsed from a minor cardiac event, exacerbated by the sheer stress of their impending financial ruin. When I flew back to Los Angeles to handle the crisis, my mother had wept openly in the cardiology wing, clutching my hands and begging me to save them from bankruptcy. I had spent hours filling out complex financial release forms and medical debt consolidation paperwork to clear their names. I had naively provided my social security number and banking details to the hospital billing department, while my mother sat right next to me watching my every move. She had secretly copied them down while I was speaking with the doctors, storing my most sensitive financial data in her purse like a weapon waiting to be deployed. The sheer calculated malice of that action was staggering. Patricia had kept my identity tucked away for 4 years, waiting for the perfect moment to exploit it. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the glowing screen, as the twisted logic of her plan became crystal clear. My mother firmly believed I was just a disposable employee at the Grand Azure estate. She assumed I was terrified of losing my job. Her reasoning was brilliantly toxic. She figured that when the $45,000 payment bounced, the resort management would immediately confront me, their supposed event coordinator, demanding the money. Patricia fully expected that I would be so paralyzed by the fear of being fired and publicly disgraced at work that I would either desperately force the resort to apply a massive staff discount to the bill, or I would quietly drain my own savings to pay it off just to make the problem disappear. She thought she was trapping a powerless subordinate. She thought she had outsmarted a desperate, insecure daughter who would do anything to keep her mediocre job. She had absolutely no idea that she had just committed a massive financial crime against a multi-billion-dollar corporation, and that the person holding the gavel was me. I did not feel a single ounce of sadness. The lingering ghost of the daughter who wanted to be loved completely vanished, entirely replaced by the cold, calculating mind of a chief executive officer. I was no longer dealing with family members. I was dealing with hostile liabilities who had just handed me the exact legal ammunition I needed to destroy them. I pulled up a blank digital notepad on my screen and began to type, outlining the precise tactical maneuvers required. I was not going to scream. I was not going to cry. I was going to execute a flawless, systematic takedown. By explicitly forging my signature and supplying my social security number to secure lines of credit and venue services across state lines, Patricia had crossed the threshold from simple civil breach of contract into severe criminal territory. Under California law, this was felony identity theft. Combined with the sheer dollar amount of the stolen services, it escalated into grand theft and felony fraud. This was no longer a family dispute over a wedding invitation. This was a severe financial crime with mandatory prison sentences attached to it. Patricia had handed me the power to literally put her behind bars. I closed the digital file and opened a direct encrypted communication channel to Harrison, my lead corporate litigator and personal powerhouse attorney. Harrison was a shark in a tailored suit, a man who thrived on dismantling arrogant fraudsters. I typed out a quick urgent message, attaching the high-resolution scans of the forged contract and the bounced banking notifications. I need you to initiate a comprehensive legal review of these documents immediately, I typed. Bring in our top forensic handwriting expert to verify the forgery against my actual legal signature. We are building an airtight, undeniable case for felony identity theft and grand theft against the primary signatories. I want the criminal complaints drafted and ready to file with the district attorney by tomorrow morning. Do not alert the local authorities just yet. I am going to set the trap first. I hit send, watching the progress bar confirm the secure transmission. I sat in the absolute silence of my boardroom, listening to the faint, steady hum of the air conditioning. The transition was complete. I was entirely detached, operating with a level of cold precision that my parents could never possibly comprehend. They thought they had backed a weak, desperate woman into a corner. They thought they could use my name to fund their fake, luxurious reality. Instead, they had just handed the executioner a signed confession. I closed my laptop and stood up, smoothing the front of my blazer. I reached for my phone, anticipating the exact timeline of her manipulation. She would wait until the afternoon, giving the resort's accounting department just enough time to supposedly notify me of the bounced payment. She would want me to be sweating, panicking at my imaginary desk, terrified of the consequences. She would call to deliver her ultimatum, fully expecting me to beg for mercy. I walked back to my desk, poured myself a glass of sparkling water, and sat down to wait. The feeling of absolute control was intoxicating. For 34 years, my mother had dictated the terms of our relationship. She had decided when I was worthy of attention and when I was meant to be discarded. But the power dynamic had permanently shifted. The game was no longer being played on her terms. The trap was set, the evidence was secured, and the full weight of my corporate empire was poised to strike. My office phone illuminated with an incoming video call precisely 15 minutes later. It was Harrison. I tapped the screen to connect, and his face appeared on my monitor. Harrison was sitting in his Century City office, a sprawling glass suite that matched my own. He was a brilliant corporate litigator, a man who possessed a terrifyingly calm demeanor in the face of absolute financial destruction. He had already reviewed the encrypted files I sent over, and I could tell by the rigid set of his jaw that he recognized the severity of the situation. Clara, Harrison began, his tone stripped of any pleasantries and sharp as a scalpel. I am looking at the contract scans now. Whoever executed this document was remarkably arrogant, but incredibly careless. They left a pristine digital trail pointing directly back to their own home IP address when they filled out the preliminary online booking forms months ago. They tied their own internet service provider to the initial venue reservation before trying to dump the final liability onto you. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the obsidian table, clasping my hands together. It was Patricia and William, I said evenly. My parents. They used my social security number and forged my signature to guarantee a $45,000 luxury wedding reception for my sister. They believe I am a mid-level event coordinator at the estate and that I will be forced to pay the debt to save my job. They think they hold my livelihood hostage. Harrison did not blink at the revelation of family betrayal. In our line of work, handling high-net-worth individuals' blood relations often made the messiest, most vicious adversaries. He simply nodded his eyes, scanning a secondary monitor on his massive desk. I have already engaged Dr. Caldwell, he said, mentioning a highly sought-after forensic handwriting analyst we kept on retainer for complex corporate espionage cases. Caldwell has your official executive signatures on file from the original Apex acquisition documents and numerous corporate filings. He ran a rapid preliminary comparative analysis against the signature on the Grand Azure contract. It is a catastrophic mismatch. The pressure variations on the pen, the slant of the lettering, the specific loop formations, none of it aligns with your established biomechanical signature profile. Caldwell is preparing a sworn affidavit right now, confirming undeniable malicious forgery. Excellent, I replied, feeling a rush of adrenaline at the sheer ruthless efficiency of my team. I want an airtight, impenetrable case, Harrison. I want them cornered legally and financially before they even realize they are in a fight. I want zero loopholes. What is our exact angle of attack? Harrison steepled his fingers, leaning into the camera with the predatory focus that made him worth his exorbitant retainer. We execute a two-pronged assault, civil and criminal. On the civil side, we file an immediate lawsuit for breach of contract and aggressive financial fraud. We will seek the principal $45,000, plus maximum punitive damages, attorney fees, and corporate disruption costs. I will draft the filings to encumber all their known assets. I will have the civil suit prepared and sealed by 5 o'clock today. And the criminal side, I asked, my voice dropping to a near whisper as the reality of my parents' impending doom solidified. That is where we secure the absolute checkmate, Harrison replied, his eyes gleaming with professional satisfaction. Under California Penal Code, acquiring credit goods or services using another person's personal identifying information constitutes felony identity theft. Furthermore, because the defrauded amount vastly exceeds $950, this automatically classifies as grand theft. Patricia and William did not just bounce a check to a local hotel. They committed a severe felony against a massive corporate entity. The district attorney will love this case because the paper trail is absolutely flawless. I stood up and began pacing the length of my boardroom, processing the legal framework as my heels clicked against the hardwood. They think they hold all the leverage right now, I told Harrison, turning back toward the monitor. They are going to attempt to extort me. My mother will threaten to call my manager at the resort to expose me as a terrible employee who ruined her pristine event. She wants to use my fear of losing my job to force me into signing a real promissory note to her bank to cover the debt. Harrison let out a sharp, humorless laugh that echoed through the speakers. She wants to extort the chief executive officer of the parent company by threatening to call a regional property manager. The absolute irony is staggering. Do you want me to dispatch a process server to their residence immediately? We can have them served before dinner. No, I said, stopping by the window to look out over the sprawling Los Angeles traffic. Do not serve them yet. I am going to let my mother play her hand. I want her to lay out her entire extortion plot while I record the conversation. It will add a formal extortion charge to the criminal complaint. I need you to put the local police precinct on standby. Contact the commanding officer of the Financial Crimes Division. Let them know that Apex Hospitality Group is preparing to hand over a fully documented open and shut felony fraud case by tomorrow afternoon. Harrison nodded, making a swift, precise note on his legal pad. I will make the call personally to the precinct captain. The Financial Crimes Unit will be ready to move the moment we give the green light. We will have the arrest warrants prepped and waiting for a judge's signature based on Caldwell's affidavit and the IP logs. Is there anything else you need to set the stage, Clara? Just have the physical dossiers bound and ready for me by tomorrow morning, I instructed. Include the forensic handwriting report, the digital IP logs, the grand theft statutes, and the master deed proving Apex owns the Grand Azure estate. I am going to hand-deliver this reality check myself. I want to see their faces when they read it. Consider it done, Harrison said before severing the encrypted connection. The boardroom descended into a thick, expectant silence once again. I walked back to my desk, my mind rapidly calculating the final steps of my strategy. Everything was perfectly aligned. The legal arsenal was fully loaded. The forensic evidence was undeniable. The Financial Crimes Division was waiting in the wings to execute the arrest warrants. My parents had spent my entire life treating me like an incompetent failure, completely unaware that they had forged their fraudulent masterpiece against a corporate predator. I sat down and smoothed the lapels of my tailored blazer. I felt a strange, profound sense of peace wash over me. The anxiety that had plagued my youth, the desperate yearning for my parents' approval, the fear of their cruel judgments, it was all completely eradicated, burned away by the sheer magnitude of their betrayal. I looked at the digital clock on my desk. It was almost 3 in the afternoon. Patricia would have received the irate phone call from the resort's automated billing department by now. The venue staff would be demanding immediate payment for the $45,000 balance. My mother would be stewing in her fake luxury home, furious that her stolen credit scheme had hit a snag, and preparing to unleash her wrath on the daughter she viewed as a weak, easy target. I watched my phone vibrate against the smooth wood of the desk, the buzzing echoing loudly in the vast boardroom. For a fleeting second, the ghost of the terrified little girl I used to be fluttered in my chest, the girl who dreaded her mother's wrath. But that girl was gone. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the power of my position ground me. I was no longer a victim. I was the architect of their downfall. I reached out my manicured hand, hovering over the glowing screen. The caller ID simply read Mom. I swiped the green icon on the screen and brought the phone to my ear. I did not say hello. I simply breathed into the receiver, waiting for her to make the first move. Well, 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 Patricia's voice crooned through the speaker. The tone was absolutely dripping with malicious glee. There was no hesitation, no hint of maternal concern, and certainly no apology for having me thrown out of my sister's wedding like a stray dog. Instead, she sounded triumphant, like a predator circling a wounded animal. I assume you have checked your messages by now. Or perhaps your little manager at the resort has already hauled you into their office for a very uncomfortable chat. I kept my breathing shallow, perfectly mirroring the anxiety of a subordinate employee caught in a devastating scandal. I let a few seconds of heavy silence stretch between us, allowing her to bask in what she thought was my paralyzing fear. "What are you talking about, Mom?" I asked, pitching my voice slightly higher to mimic panic. Patricia let out a sharp, theatrical sigh. "Oh, Clara, please do not play dumb. It does not suit you. I am talking about the $45,000 final invoice for Brittany's wedding reception, the one that was due this morning. It seems there was a minor issue with our primary bank account, a simple mix-up really, but the resort's accounting department was quite insistent about getting their money, so they automatically billed the financial guarantor on file." I gripped the edge of my mahogany desk, marveling at her absolute lack of shame. "You put me down as the guarantor," I whispered, injecting a violent tremor into my voice. "Mom, how could you do that? I never signed any contract." Patricia laughed. It was a cold, grating sound that vibrated through the phone. It was the laugh of a woman completely detached from reality, entirely consumed by her own manufactured superiority. "Do not be dramatic, Clara. I simply used that social security number you so helpfully provided a few years ago. You work at the Grand Azure estate, do you not? You are always bragging about your little job in the hospitality industry. So figure it out. Use your staff discount. Talk to your boss. Set up a payment plan from your salary. I really do not care how you handle it, but you are going to pay that $45,000. I forced a frantic gasp into the receiver. "Mom, that is $45,000. I do not have that kind of money lying around. You forged my signature. You used my SSN. If the general manager finds out about this, I could get fired. I could go to jail." Patricia clicked her tongue in irritation. "Jail. Stop being so hysterical. No one is going to jail. You are an employee there. Just go into the back office, bat your eyelashes at whoever is in charge, and make the bill disappear. You owe us this, Clara. Consider it the price for embarrassing us by showing up at the gate on Saturday." I squeezed my eyes shut, letting the sheer audacity of her entitlement wash over me. She actually believed this was a justified punishment. She honestly thought that forcing her eldest daughter into massive fraudulent debt was an appropriate penalty for merely attempting to attend her own sister's wedding. "You planned this from the start," I said, making my voice sound appropriately devastated. "You booked an extravagant wedding you knew you could not afford, and you planned to stick me with the bill all along." "We deserve nice things," Patricia snapped, dropping the playful glee for a moment of raw, defensive anger. "Brittany deserves the best. She married into the Thornton family. Do you have any idea how wealthy Malik is? How much status his parents have? We had to match their energy. We had to prove we belonged in their circle. We could not let them know our cash flow was temporarily tied up. And you certainly were not going to help us voluntarily. You proved how selfish you were when you refused to pay for Brittany's honeymoon flights. So you stole my identity," I cried out, fully committing to the performance of a terrified, broken daughter. "Mom, I cannot afford this. I will lose my apartment. I will lose my job. They are going to fire me. Please, you have to call the resort and tell them the truth. You have to fix this." Patricia's laughter returned louder and more cruel this time. She was absolutely feeding off my fake desperation, drinking it in like fine wine. "Call them and say what, Clara? That I forged a document. I am not an idiot. You are the one whose name is on the dotted line. You are the one who works there. If you do not pay this by tomorrow, the resort is going to come after you, not me." I let out a ragged, manufactured sob, pressing my hand over the receiver to muffle the sound of my own steady, calculating breathing. I needed her to explicitly state her extortion terms. I needed her to tie the noose around her own neck so tightly that Harrison would not even have to try in court. "Mom, please," I whimpered. "I am begging you. I do not have $45,000. I will be ruined." "Then you better start pulling extra shifts," Patricia sneered, completely devoid of empathy. "You have 24 hours to make that balance read zero. I do not care if you have to scrub every toilet in that resort to pay it off. You brought this on yourself when you decided to be a selfish, unsupportive sister. Now you get to pay the price." "And Clara—" "Yes," I choked out. "Do not ever try to humiliate this family again," she warned, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "We are done playing nice with you." I held the phone to my ear, listening to her ragged, angry breathing on the other end of the line. The performance was flawless. She had handed me exactly what I needed. Every single word was a nail in her coffin, a perfect, undeniable confirmation of her malicious intent, her forgery, and her complete willingness to destroy my life for her own vanity. I let a long, heavy silence stretch over the line, playing the part of the defeated, broken woman she wanted me to be. When I finally spoke, my voice was small, defeated, and perfectly compliant. "Okay, Mom," I whispered. "Okay. Just please do not hang up yet. Let me think. Let me try to figure something out." I could practically hear her smiling through the phone. "That is a good girl," Patricia said, her tone suddenly reverting to that sickening fake sweetness. "I knew you would see reason once you calmed down. Just handle it, Clara. Handle it quietly, and we can all move on." I lowered the phone from my ear, ending the call with a swift tap of my finger. The silence of the penthouse rushed back in, but it no longer felt empty. It felt charged with kinetic energy. I stood up, walked over to the bar cart, and picked up my glass of bourbon. I took a slow sip, letting the burning liquid coat my throat. Patricia had taken the bait perfectly. She believed she had won. She believed she had crushed me under her heel. She was entirely convinced that by tomorrow her massive wedding debt would magically vanish, paid for by the sweat and tears of her disposable daughter. She was right about one thing: the debt would vanish. But the cost was going to be her entire world. Just as I set my glass down, the screen of my phone illuminated again, vibrating violently against the marble countertop. The caller ID flashed my mother's name a second time. She was not finished. Narcissists rarely are. They need to ensure their victim is entirely crushed before they retreat. I cleared my throat, summoned the frantic, trembling persona I had just perfected, and accepted the call. "I forgot to mention one tiny detail, Clara," Patricia hissed, her voice dropping all pretense of maternal sweetness. It was pure, unadulterated venom. "I want to make myself absolutely clear. If I do not get a confirmation email from the resort tomorrow showing a zero balance, I am calling the general manager of the Grand Azure Estate directly." I let out a sharp gasp, perfectly timing my reaction to feed her ego. "Mom, you said you would give me time to figure this out." "I changed my mind," she snapped. "If you try to run from this, I will tell your boss that you are a thief. I will tell them you stole our financial information to cover up your own massive debts. I will say you have been stealing from your own family for years, and that you forged those venue documents to hide your embezzlement. They will not just fire you, Clara. They will have you arrested. You will be blacklisted from the entire hospitality industry. You will be utterly ruined." The threat was so vicious, so flawlessly cruel, that for a split second I genuinely marveled at her capacity for evil. She was willing to orchestrate my complete professional and legal destruction over a wedding reception. I forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged, letting out a convincing sob. "Please, I begged, my voice cracking dramatically. Please do not call my boss. I will lose everything. I cannot just make $45,000 appear out of thin air by tomorrow morning. I need a payment plan. I need to sit down and talk about this. Let me come to the house tomorrow. We can work things out as a family. Patricia scoffed loudly. There is nothing to work out. You sign a promissory note, you assume the debt, and you leave us alone. I cannot do it without explaining it to the rest of the family, I pleaded, injecting a note of desperate bargaining into my tone. If I am going to take on this massive financial burden, I need everyone to understand why. I will come to the house tomorrow morning. But Brittany and Malik have to be there, and Malik's parents too. Why on earth would I involve Malik's family in your pathetic financial drama? Patricia demanded, her voice sharp with sudden suspicion. Because if I am going to be financially ruined to pay for Brittany's wedding, I need them to know I am doing it for her, I cried, weaving a masterful web of desperation. I need Malik's family to understand why I might have to ask them for a loan later. I need them to see that I am taking this hit to protect the family name. If you do not let me explain it to everyone, I will just go to the police right now and confess to the forgery myself. I will tell them I did it, but I will drag you down with me. It was a bluff, of course, but it was the exact kind of chaotic, desperate threat a cornered animal would make. I could hear the gears turning in my mother's head. Patricia was a woman obsessed with social hierarchy. Malik came from a highly respected, fiercely principled family of architects and surgeons. His parents were wealthy, dignified, and totally unaware of the fraudulent foundation my family operated on. Suddenly, Patricia saw an opportunity. She did not just see a way to force me into paying the debt. She saw a stage. If she brought Malik's family into the living room, she could use me as the ultimate scapegoat. She could paint me as the troubled, unstable, gambling-addicted daughter who had nearly ruined the wedding. She could perform the role of the benevolent, long-suffering mother who was gracefully handling her delinquent child. It would cement her status as a martyr and elevate her in the eyes of her wealthy new-in-laws. Fine, Patricia said, her voice dripping with sudden dark satisfaction. Tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock sharp, Malik and his parents are staying at the house tonight before their flight back to Chicago tomorrow afternoon. It will be the perfect audience for you to finally take responsibility for your miserable life. You will come here, you will admit to your financial problems, and you will sign a legally binding document transferring the resort debt solely to your name. Thank you, Mom, I whimpered, making sure I sounded thoroughly defeated. I will be there. Do not be late, Clara. Or I make the call, she threatened one last time before abruptly terminating the connection. I lowered the phone and set it gently beside my glass of bourbon. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face. The trap was not just set. The prey had actively walked inside and locked the door behind themselves. Patricia thought she was organizing a public execution for my character. She thought she was gathering an audience to watch me beg for mercy while she played the gracious, wealthy matriarch. She had no idea she had just arranged her own financial and legal funeral. I opened my encrypted laptop once more and sent a final message to Harrison. The meeting is set for 10 in the morning at my parents' residence. The entire family will be present, including the groom and his parents. Ensure the police are positioned out of sight, but ready to breach the moment I give the signal. Have the physical dossiers bound and delivered to my penthouse by 7 tomorrow morning. Harrison replied almost instantly. The warrants are signed. The detectives are briefed. Sleep well, Clara. Tomorrow we dismantle them. I closed the laptop and walked toward the sprawling glass windows of my penthouse. The city lights of Los Angeles stretched out endlessly below me, a glowing grid of power and commerce. For my entire life, my parents had made me feel small, insignificant, and unworthy of their love. They had demanded everything and given absolutely nothing in return. They had used my loyalty as a weapon against me. But loyalty, when abused for too long, transforms into something entirely different. It transforms into absolute unyielding justice. I finished my drink, turned off the lights, and prepared for tomorrow. The era of the struggling invisible daughter was over. The chief executive officer was ready to go to work. The morning fog was just beginning to burn off the manicured lawns of my parents' suburban neighborhood when my hired black car pulled to a smooth stop. I stepped out into the crisp California air, my sleek leather briefcase gripped firmly in my right hand. The house sitting at the end of the cul-de-sac was a towering monument to financial desperation dressed up as success. It was a classic McMansion boasting faux stone pillars and a grand entryway that tried far too hard to impress. Parked aggressively in the center of the circular driveway was my father's gleaming white Mercedes-Benz. A quick glance at the license plate frame revealed the dealership tag from a notorious high-interest leasing company. Beside it sat Brittany's brand-new Range Rover, another leased luxury vehicle, undoubtedly financed by the very credit cards my parents were currently defaulting on. To the untrained eye, it looked like the home of a highly successful, wealthy family. But looking at the peeling paint near the gutters and the overgrown hedges they could no longer afford to have professionally landscaped, I saw nothing but a collapsing house of cards. I walked up the sweeping concrete steps, the rhythmic clicking of my heels announcing my arrival. The heavy double doors were slightly ajar, a clear stage direction, meant to invite me straight into the performance. I pushed the door open and stepped into the grand foyer. Sitting prominently on the entryway console table was my mother's supposedly exclusive designer handbag. Even from 5 feet away, I could spot the uneven stitching and the slightly flawed metallic hardware of a cheap counterfeit. It was a perfect metaphor for everything that was about to happen. I walked directly into the sunken living room. The air was instantly thick, suffocating under the weight of heavy tension and cheap floral perfume. The seating arrangement had been meticulously orchestrated. My parents, Patricia and William, sat on the plush velvet sofa to the right, sitting perfectly upright to project an air of tragic dignity. Across from them sat Malik and his parents. The contrast between the two families was stark and deeply uncomfortable. Malik's parents, Dr. Warren Thornton and his wife Sylvia, a retired appellate judge, sat with quiet, authentic grace. They wore understated, impeccably tailored clothes. They did not need massive logos or flashy watches to communicate their worth. They simply radiated the quiet confidence of people who had built generational wealth through actual hard work and unwavering integrity. They looked polite, but undeniably tense, their hands resting neatly in their laps as they observed the bizarre family dynamic unfolding before them. Malik sat rigidly beside them. His sharp, intelligent eyes immediately locked onto me as I entered the room. He looked profoundly confused, his brow furrowed as he tried to reconcile the image of the dangerous, unstable sister his new wife had described with the calm, sharply dressed executive standing in his in-laws' living room. And then there was Brittany. The moment my shoe touched the living room carpet, my sister initiated her performance. She let out a sharp, trembling gasp that sounded like it had been rehearsed in front of a mirror for hours. She threw herself sideways, burying her face into Malik's shoulder and clutching the lapels of his suit jacket with white-knuckled desperation. "Please," Brittany whimpered, her voice muffled against the expensive fabric of his suit. "Please tell her not to ruin this. I cannot handle any more of her outbursts today. I am so scared she is going to make a scene." Malik instinctively wrapped a protective arm around his weeping bride, but his eyes never left mine. His gaze was analytical, sweeping over my perfectly tailored charcoal suit, my steady posture, and the heavy leather briefcase resting against my leg. He was a man who engineered buildings to withstand earthquakes. He knew how to spot structural flaws, and Brittany's manufactured hysterics were structurally unsound. Patricia seized her cue immediately. She stood up from the velvet sofa, placing a hand dramatically over her heart. She wore an expression of profound, exhausted sorrow, playing the role of the benevolent, deeply wounded matriarch to absolute perfection. She looked at Malik's parents with a tragic, helpless smile before turning her deeply fake, sorrowful gaze upon me. "Clara," Patricia said, her voice shaking with manufactured grief. "Thank you for coming. I know it takes courage for you to face us after everything that has happened over the last few days. We are not here to attack you. We brought everyone together because we love you, and because this family can no longer continue to shield you from the consequences of your own destructive behavior." I did not flinch. I did not speak. I simply stood in the dead center of the room, my feet planted firmly on the Persian rug, clutching my briefcase. I let the silence stretch, forcing them to fill the void with their own desperate acting. William sighed heavily, leaning forward and resting his elbows on his knees, playing the exhausted patriarch. We just want to help you, Clara. But you have to admit you have a problem. You cannot keep lashing out at your sister because of your own financial failures. It is tearing your mother apart. I watched them closely, studying every micro-expression, every forced tear, every desperate glance they shot toward Malik's parents to ensure the wealthy in-laws were buying the performance. They were painting a masterpiece of deception. They were utilizing every ounce of my forced silence over the years to build a narrative where I was a bitter, broken, dangerous woman who needed to be controlled. Brittany let out another theatrical sob, pressing her face deeper into Malik's chest. Malik gently rubbed her back, but his jaw was clenched. He was looking at the woman standing calmly in the center of the room, holding a briefcase like a weapon, and he was beginning to realize that the math of this situation simply did not add up. I remained entirely silent. I was a predator watching a group of desperate scavengers wander directly into an open snare. The bait had been taken, the audience was seated, the theater of lies was in full production. All that was left was for Patricia to hand me the match so I could burn the entire house to the ground. Patricia turned her attention away from me and focused entirely on Dr. Warren Thornton and his wife Sylvia. She let out a long, shuddering breath, pressing her manicured fingers to her temples, as if the mere act of acknowledging my presence was a heavy physical burden. Warren and Sylvia Patricia began, her voice dripping with a sorrowful, practiced apology. I cannot express how deeply ashamed William and I are that you have to witness this display. We tried so hard to shield you and Malik from our family's greatest tragedy. We wanted Brittany's transition into your wonderful family to be completely untainted by our personal nightmare. Sylvia leaned forward slightly, her judicial instincts clearly engaged. What exactly is the nightmare, Patricia? She asked, her tone polite but highly guarded. Patricia pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest. Clara is severely ill. She has been battling a catastrophic gambling addiction for the better part of a decade. She has decimated her own life, blown through every opportunity we ever gave her, and now she is trying to destroy her sister out of pure spiteful jealousy. I maintained my absolute silence. I did not shift my weight. I did not blink. I let the horrific lie hang in the air, watching closely to see how Malik and his parents processed the sheer audacity of the accusation. She showed up at the wedding venue completely unhinged. Patricia continued, wiping a non-existent tear from her cheek. She was demanding money to pay off violent loan sharks. When our security team bravely turned her away, she threatened to ruin Brittany's reputation in front of your family. She is a desperate, dangerous woman who will do anything for a payout. Brittany decided it was the perfect time to add her own layer of venom to the performance. She lifted her head from Malik's chest, her eyes wide and fearful. She looked at her new in-laws with the flawless expression of a protective younger sister who had been pushed entirely too far. It is true, Brittany sniffled, gripping Malik's hand tighter to anchor her lie. Clara has been leeching off our parents for years. She refuses to hold down a real job. Mom and Dad had to take out a second mortgage on this beautiful house just to cover the massive debts Clara racked up in underground casinos. They have sacrificed their entire retirement fund to keep her out of prison. Brittany turned her tear-filled eyes up to Malik. That is why I had to ban her from the wedding, Malik. I had to protect you. I had to protect your parents. She is completely toxic. If I let her into that reception, she would have harassed your family for money. She might have even stolen from the guests' purses. I could not let my sister's sickness infect the happiest day of our lives. The narrative they were weaving was bold, vicious, and entirely fabricated. They were banking heavily on the fact that wealthy, respectable people like the Thorntons would be so horrified by the mere mention of addiction and police involvement that they would immediately side with the victims. They fully expected Malik to wrap his arms around Brittany, validate her pain, and demand that I leave the premises immediately. But my family had severely miscalculated exactly who they were dealing with. Malik did not pull Brittany closer to comfort her. Instead, he gently but firmly unhooked her fingers from his lapels and took a deliberate half-step back, creating a distinct physical boundary between himself and his weeping bride. His dark, intelligent eyes scanned the room, moving from the peeling paint on the ceiling molding to Patricia's counterfeit designer bag on the console table, and finally resting squarely on me. As a highly successful architect, Malik built structures designed to weather the most brutal elements. He understood the fundamental laws of physics and reality better than anyone. If a foundation was rotten, the building would eventually collapse. Right now, he was analyzing the structural integrity of my family's story, and he was finding massive glaring cracks in the foundation. Patricia Malik said, his voice deep, resonant, and entirely devoid of the sympathetic outrage my mother had been fishing for. "You are saying that Clara is a destitute, unemployed gambling addict who relies entirely on your financial charity to survive?" "Yes." Patricia nodded vigorously, eager to lock in her deceptive narrative. "She drains us dry. We have absolutely nothing left to give her." Malik crossed his arms over his chest. He looked at me again. He took in the immaculate cut of my custom-tailored wool suit. He noticed the subtle, understated elegance of my posture. He saw the expensive, highly structured leather briefcase I held with absolute terrifying calm. "If Clara is destitute and completely dependent on your charity?" Malik asked, his tone shifting into something sharp and deeply inquisitive. "How did she afford a last-minute international flight from London to Los Angeles just to crash a wedding? And why does she look like an executive who just walked out of a high-level corporate boardroom rather than a desperate addict fleeing from loan sharks?" The room went dead silent. The question hit the floor like a lead weight, shattering the illusion Patricia had worked so hard to build. William stammered, his face flushing a deep, embarrassed red. "She manipulates people, Malik. She cons men into buying things for her. It is all a facade to hide her sickness." Sylvia, the retired judge, finally spoke up. Her voice cut through the room with icy, analytical precision. "A facade requires funding, William. And as someone who has presided over hundreds of addiction and fraud cases, I must say your daughter does not exhibit a single behavioral marker of a desperate addict. In fact, she is the only person in this room who seems completely in control of her emotions." Brittany panicked. Her carefully constructed victim routine was unraveling at a terrifying speed. "You do not know her like we do," she cried out, stepping frantically toward Malik's parents. "She is a sociopath. She can fake being normal when she wants something. Right now, she just wants to extort us for cash." "Extort you," Malik repeated, turning his sharp gaze back to his wife. "Brittany, you told me your parents were incredibly wealthy. You said they paid for half of our luxury wedding without batting an eye. Yet your mother just claimed they took out a second mortgage to cover Clara's debts and have no retirement savings left. Which story is true?" Patricia realized the trap she had just walked into. In her sheer desperation to smear my character, she had accidentally exposed their own financial ruin to the very people they were trying to impress. She began to backpedal frantically, her hands fluttering in the air as she tried to patch the massive holes in her sinking ship. "Malik, please, you are misunderstanding the situation," Patricia said, her voice rising in pitch. "Our wealth is tied up in solid investments. The mortgage was just a temporary liquidity measure because of Clara's sudden legal fees. We are perfectly fine financially. We are just exhausted by her constant aggressive demands." Malik did not look convinced. He looked actively repulsed. He was a man who valued truth above all else, and the air in the living room was incredibly thick with deception. "Clara has not spoken a single word since she walked through that door," Malik observed quietly, looking directly at me. "She has not demanded money. She has not threatened anyone. She has simply watched you all panic. So I am going to ask the obvious question." He turned his back on my parents and faced me fully, offering a gesture of respectful inquiry. "Clara, why are you really here today? Why are you—" I smiled. It was a small, genuine smile that acknowledged Malik's sharp intellect. He had seen right through the noise. He had stripped away the hysterics and demanded the truth. It was finally time to give it to him. Before I could utter a single syllable to answer, Patricia shoved her way between us. She was terrified. The carefully constructed narrative was slipping through her manicured fingers, and she knew that if I actually started talking to her new son-in-law, the illusion of their generational wealth and moral superiority would shatter into a million irreparable pieces. She needed to regain control of the room immediately. She marched over to the heavy glass coffee table in the center of the seating arrangement. Her hand plunged into her counterfeit designer bag, pulling out a thick, aggressively stapled stack of papers. With a dramatic, sweeping motion, she slammed the documents down onto the glass. The sharp smack echoed through the tense living room, making Brittany flinch and draw back. "Here is the $45,000 bill from the wedding reception," Patricia announced, her voice rising to a frantic, commanding pitch. She jabbed her index finger violently against the top page, her eyes wild with a desperate need to dominate. "You ruined the entire vibe of the wedding with your stunt at the security gate. You caused Brittany severe emotional distress on the most important day of her life, so you are paying for it. Consider it restitution for your toxic behavior." She reached into her bag again and pulled out a separate single sheet of paper, laying it next to the invoice. "This is a legally binding promissory note addressed to our bank. It transfers the entire balance of the venue debt directly into your name. Sign it right now." Malik took a step forward, his jaw dropping in absolute disbelief at the sheer audacity of the demand. "Patricia, what on earth are you doing?" he demanded, stepping between his weeping wife and the coffee table. "You cannot possibly ask her to sign a financial guarantee under this kind of duress. This is bordering on coercion." "Stay out of this!" Malik William barked, finally abandoning his exhausted patriarch routine and showing his true bullying colors. He puffed out his chest, stepping up beside his wife to present a united hostile front. "This is family business. We are holding our daughter accountable for her actions. She owes us this money for the damage she has caused, and she is going to take responsibility today." Patricia ignored Malik completely, keeping her crazed, desperate eyes fixed squarely on me. "I am giving you one chance to make this right, Clara," she sneered. Her voice dropped into a vicious, extortionist whisper that the entire room could still clearly hear. It was laced with poison and decades of unchecked entitlement. "If you do not pick up a pen and sign that promissory note this exact second, I am making the phone call. I will call your manager at the resort. I will tell them you are a thief who tries to steal from her own family to fund her gambling addiction. I will make sure you lose your job before lunchtime. You will be utterly ruined, Clara. Sign the paper." Brittany sniffled, wiping away her fake tears and standing up straight. Her previous hysterics magically vanished now that the financial demand was on the table, revealing the calculating opportunist lurking beneath the bridal glow. "Just sign it, Clara," she snapped impatiently, crossing her arms. "Mom is actually doing you a favor by keeping the police out of this. You should be thanking us. Just pay the bill and we can all move on with our lives." The tension in the living room peaked, swelling until it felt like all the oxygen had been sucked out of the space. Dr. Warren Thornton and his wife Sylvia sat frozen on the velvet sofa, their expressions reflecting sheer, unadulterated horror at the blatant, aggressive extortion taking place right in front of them. They had spent their entire lives building careers on ethics and the rule of law. Now they were trapped in a suburban living room, watching a mother actively blackmail her own flesh and blood. Sylvia, the retired judge, looked at the promissory note on the table and then up at me. Her eyes communicated a silent, desperate warning, silently pleading with me not to put my signature on that fraudulent document. I looked down at the forged contract lying on the glass surface. I let my eyes trace the absurd, bloated line items for imported flowers and vintage champagne. I looked at the $45,000 invoice that they genuinely believed they could force onto my shoulders through sheer intimidation. Then I lifted my gaze and looked directly at Malik's parents. "Dr. Thornton?" "Sylvia." I said, my voice incredibly soft and remarkably polite, cutting through the heavy hostile air like a silver blade. "I am profoundly sorry for what you are about to witness. You came here expecting a standard family meeting to resolve a minor dispute, and instead you have been dragged into a very ugly, incredibly dark reality. Please forgive the mess that is about to unfold." Patricia scoffed loudly, throwing her hands up in the air. "Stop performing for the in-laws and sign the document, Clara. You do not have a choice, you are out of options." That was the exact moment the final thread of my act snapped. I let the terrified, victimized daughter persona fall away, completely discarding it like a heavy, suffocating coat I no longer needed to wear. My shoulders rolled back my spine, straightening as my posture shifted into the commanding, absolute authority of a chief executive officer holding a royal flush. The frightened hesitation in my eyes vanished, replaced by an unbreakable, predatory calm. I did not cry. I did not beg. I did not reach for the pen lying on the table. Instead, I laughed. It started as a low, rumbling chuckle in the back of my throat, but it quickly grew into a full, echoing laugh that bounced off the high ceilings of the McMansion. It was a cold, sharp, terrifying sound. It possessed absolutely zero warmth, zero joy, and zero submission. It was the laugh of someone who had just watched their enemies march willingly into an inescapable trap. The sheer chilling sound of it instantly froze the entire room. William took an involuntary step backward, his bullying bravado faltering. Patricia's arms dropped limply to her sides, her eyes widening in sudden primal panic as she realized the script had just been violently flipped. Brittany clamped her mouth shut, her eyes darting nervously toward Malik. My laugh stripped away all their power in a matter of seconds, leaving them completely naked and entirely vulnerable to the absolute destruction I was about to unleash. The laughter faded, leaving a chilling, suffocating silence in its wake. I did not break eye contact with my mother as I stepped forward, closing the distance between myself and the glass coffee table. I hoisted my sleek leather briefcase and set it down right next to her fraudulent invoice. The sharp metallic click of the brass latches snapping open sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. Patricia flinched her hands, gripping the edge of the velvet sofa as if bracing for a physical impact. I reached inside the velvet-lined interior of my briefcase and pulled out a thick, professionally bound legal dossier. It bore the embossed crest of one of the most ruthless corporate litigation firms in Los Angeles. I bypassed my parents entirely. They were no longer my audience. They were the accused. I turned my attention directly to the man who had been dragged into this circus of lies. I held the heavy dossier in my right hand and slid it smoothly across the glass surface of the coffee table, pushing it until it rested precisely in front of Malik. Before anyone pays a single cent for this fraudulent spectacle, "Malik, you should read this," I instructed, my voice echoing with absolute corporate authority. It is a forensic handwriting analysis and a digital footprint report proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that my mother committed felony identity theft to forge my signature. The color drained from Patricia's face instantly, leaving her skin an ashen, sickly gray. Her jaw went slack, and the performative outrage she had wielded moments ago evaporated into sheer, unadulterated terror. William, operating on pure, panicked instinct, lunged forward from the sofa. His hand shot out across the table, desperate to snatch the incriminating dossier before Malik could touch it. But Malik was younger, faster, and operating on highly attuned defensive reflexes. He intercepted my father's wrist with a firm, unyielding grip, stopping the older man dead in his tracks. "Do not touch that," Malik warned, his deep voice vibrating with a dangerous, quiet fury. William swallowed hard, his eyes wide with fear, and slowly pulled his hand back, retreating to the safety of the sofa like a scolded child. Malik picked up the thick dossier. The room held its collective breath as he flipped open the heavy cardstock cover. I watched his eyes scan the executive summary prepared by Harrison and Dr. Caldwell. I knew exactly what he was reading. He was looking at high-resolution microscopic comparisons of the forged signature alongside my actual legally verified handwriting. He was reading the detailed breakdown of the biomechanical discrepancies, the incorrect pen pressure, the mismatched angles, and the unnatural hesitation marks that proved the signature was a malicious fabrication. He turned the page, his expression darkening from confusion into absolute profound disgust. The next section detailed the digital evidence. I made sure to narrate the findings for the benefit of the entire room, ensuring no one could hide behind ignorance. That report includes the Internet protocol logs provided by the venue's online booking system, I stated clearly, my voice carrying to every corner of the living room. It proves that the initial contract, the one containing my highly confidential social security number, was executed from the private wireless network located inside this exact house. "You did not just sign my name, Mom," You orchestrated a premeditated digital financial crime from the comfort of your own living room. Patricia began to stammer, her hands shaking violently in her lap. Clara, you do not understand. She pleaded, her voice high and breathless with panic. It was just a placeholder. The venue required a guarantor, and we were waiting for some investments to clear. We fully intended to transfer the liability back to our own names before the final bill came due. It was just a temporary measure to secure the date for your sister. You are taking this entirely out of context. I stared down at her, feeling absolutely no pity for the woman who had brought me into the world. A placeholder does not require stealing your daughter's identity, I replied, my tone dropping to a freezing analytical baseline. A placeholder does not involve committing grand theft against a luxury venue, and it certainly does not involve the phone call you made to me yesterday afternoon. I pivoted smoothly, directing my attention to Malik's parents. Sylvia, the retired judge, was watching me with intense, calculating eyes. She recognized the legal terminology I was deploying. She knew a trap when she saw one, and she knew my parents were caught dead in the center of it. I looked back at Patricia, ready to deliver the final crushing blow to her extortion plot. You thought you had me cornered, Mom. I continued, stepping closer to the coffee table. You thought I was a terrified mid-level hotel employee who would empty her savings account rather than face professional ruin. You called me and explicitly demanded that I pay your $45,000 debt. When I begged you to reconsider, you doubled down. You looked at my parents, making sure every word landed with maximum impact. You threatened to call my boss to get me fired for a $45,000 debt. You threatened to tell my employer that I was a thief who was embezzling money to fund a fake gambling addiction. That is extortion. The word hung in the air, heavy and loaded with criminal implications. Extortion. Grand theft. Identity theft. These were not family disagreements. These were felonies carrying mandatory prison sentences under California law. William buried his face in his hands, realizing the insurmountable legal avalanche crashing down upon them. Brittany sat frozen beside Malik, her mouth slightly open, completely unable to process the fact that her perfect wedding was funded by actual criminal activity. You tried to blackmail me, I stated, the finality in my voice, ringing like a gavel strike. You tried to leverage my livelihood to pay for imported orchids and vintage champagne. You thought you could use my fear to fund this fraudulent leased lifestyle you parade around in front of decent people. But you made one catastrophic miscalculation. You assumed I was powerless. You assumed I was exactly the weak, obedient scapegoat you trained me to be. Malik slowly closed the dossier and placed it back onto the glass table. The thud of the heavy document seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. He looked at Patricia, his face an impenetrable mask of absolute contempt. He did not say a word to her. He did not need to. The disgust radiating from his posture was total and complete. He looked at me, waiting for the final piece of the puzzle, waiting for me to reveal exactly why I was so entirely unafraid of their pathetic threats. You threatened to call my manager at the Grand Azure? I said, my voice cutting through the heavy silence. You explicitly promised to have me fired if I refused to sign that fraudulent debt over to my own name. But you cannot call my manager Mom, because I own the resort. I am the chief executive officer of Apex Hospitality Group. You did not scam a mid-level hotel employee. You committed felony grand theft against my corporation. The sheer impact of that statement hit the room like a seismic shockwave. Patricia gasped, stumbling backward until her knees hit the sofa, collapsing onto the velvet cushions, as if all the bones in her legs had suddenly turned to dust. William stood paralyzed, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The illusion was completely annihilated. I was not the struggling failure they had painted me to be. I was the billionaire architect of their impending destruction. But I was not finished. The extortion attempt was just the catalyst. It was time to completely dismantle the massive generational facade they had used to trap Malik and his dignified family. I reached back into my leather briefcase and pulled out a second, equally thick dossier. This one was bound in stark red. I dropped it onto the glass coffee table right next to the forensic handwriting report. Since we are laying all our cards on the table, I announced, turning my gaze toward Malik and his parents. it is only fair that you know exactly who you just married into. My parents and my sister have spent the last 2 years convincing you that they come from substantial wealth. They bragged about their investment portfolios, their luxury cars, and their high society connections. They made you believe they were your financial equals. I tapped the red folder with my index finger. This is a comprehensive financial background check compiled by my corporate investigators. Patricia and William are flat broke. They do not have a retirement fund. They do not have investment portfolios. This house, the very roof over our heads right now, is currently in pre-foreclosure. Sylvia Thornton gasped softly, her hand flying to her chest. Dr. Thornton leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he stared at my parents who were currently shrinking into the sofa, completely unable to mount a defense. 4 years ago, they were 60 days away from eviction. I continued speaking with the cold precision of an auditor presenting a bankruptcy report. They had maxed out every line of credit available to them to fund Brittany's lavish lifestyle. I know this because I was the one who paid their mortgage. I wired hundreds of thousands of dollars to save them from ruin. They took my money, secured their housing, and then immediately went back to their fraudulent spending habits, funding their delusions with high-interest loans they had absolutely no way to repay. "That is a lie," Brittany shrieked, finally breaking her stunned silence. She launched herself off the sofa, her face red and contorted with fury. "Malik, do not listen to her. She is making this up to ruin my life. My parents are wealthy. My lifestyle is real. Is it Brittany?" I challenged, not raising my voice a single decibel. I opened the red folder and began sliding documents across the glass table toward her new husband. "Let us talk about your lifestyle. Here is the lease agreement for your new Range Rover, financed at a predatory 22% interest rate because your credit score is heavily damaged. Here are the authentication reports on the designer handbags you proudly parade around. They are high-quality counterfeits imported from overseas." Brittany lunged toward the table, desperate to sweep the papers away, but Malik stepped in front of her. He put his hand firmly on her shoulder, physically stopping her from destroying the evidence. He picked up the vehicle lease agreement, his eyes scanning the aggressive interest rates and the desperately extended payment terms. "Malik, please," Brittany begged, her voice pitching into a hysterical whine. "She fabricated all of this. She hired people to print fake documents." "These are officially stamped banking records and certified property deeds," I stated, pulling the final, most devastating document from the folder. "And here is the itemized list of where the money went when Malik gave you $10,000 last month. You told him it was to help our parents pay for an unexpected medical emergency." Malik stiffened. His head snapped toward Brittany, his eyes burning with a sudden, intense betrayal. He had given her that money out of the goodness of his heart, believing he was helping his future in-laws through a health crisis. "There was no medical emergency," I revealed, sliding the bank statement toward Malik. "Patricia and William are perfectly healthy. Brittany took your $10,000 and immediately used it to pay down the maxed-out credit card she used to purchase her customized bridal accessories and those imported white orchids for the reception. You did not pay for a medical bill, Malik. You unknowingly funded your own extravagant wedding reception because her parents were entirely bankrupt." Brittany screamed, a raw, piercing sound of absolute defeat. She tried to grab the bank statement, but her hands were shaking too violently. "Shut up," she yelled at me, tears streaming down her face. "Just shut up. You are ruining everything." "I am not ruining anything," I replied smoothly, looking down at my sister. "I am simply providing the receipts. You spent your entire life mocking me for working hard. You called me a failure because I did not care about designer labels or country club memberships. You built a fake life to trap a good, honest man into marriage, hoping his family wealth would save you from your own financial incompetence." The paperwork on the table was utterly irrefutable. Every single lie they had told to secure this marriage was systematically dismantled and laid bare under the harsh light of reality. I had stripped away the leased cars, the fake bags, the non-existent trust funds, and the imaginary medical emergencies. Patricia and William sat in total silence, completely destroyed by the undeniable proof of their fraud. Brittany stood trembling in the center of the room, her carefully crafted high society persona shattered into a million jagged pieces. I looked at Malik, watching the realization wash over his features. The man of intense logic and integrity now clearly understood that the family he had just married into was nothing but a parasite waiting to drain him dry. I stood in silence and watched the absolute transformation take over Malik. For several long seconds, he did not move a single muscle. He simply stared down at the bank statement resting on the glass coffee table, his eyes tracing the itemized transactions that exposed his new wife as a ruthless con artist. As an architect, Malik was a man whose entire career relied on precision, transparency, and structural honesty. He built monuments meant to last generations. Now I could see the horrifying realization washing over him that the marriage he had just entered was constructed out of cheap plaster and toxic deception. He slowly picked up the bank statement. His large hands held the paper with a terrifying calmness. He looked at the date of the $10,000 transfer. I knew exactly what was playing through his mind. He was remembering the day Brittany had come to him weeping those same manufactured tears, begging for financial help, because her father supposedly needed an emergency surgical procedure. He was remembering how he had transferred the funds without a second thought, driven by the protective instinct of a man who cherished family. Then his gaze shifted to the corresponding expenditures listed just days later. High-end floral arrangements, custom bridal alterations, premium champagne orders. Every single dollar of his generous, worried contribution had been funneled directly into the vanity of the woman standing beside him. The money meant to save a life had been used to buy imported orchids to impress his own parents. The sheer depravity of that choice hit Malik like a physical blow. The air in the room grew completely stagnant as he slowly lowered the paper back to the table. He turned his head and looked at Brittany. The warm, loving devotion that had anchored his expression just moments ago was entirely gone, replaced by a chilling clinical detachment. Brittany shrank back under his heavy gaze. She tried to reach out and touch his arm, but Malik took a sharp, deliberate step backward. "Do not touch me," he commanded, his voice so quiet and terrifyingly steady that it demanded absolute obedience. Brittany froze, her hand hovering in the empty space between them. "Malik, let me explain," she pleaded, her voice trembling, as the reality of her collapsing world began to set in. "It is not what it looks like. We just wanted the day to be beautiful for your family. We wanted you to be proud of us." "You stole from me," Malik stated, cutting through her pathetic excuses with surgical precision. "You looked me directly in the eyes, you manufactured a fake medical crisis for your own father, and you stole $10,000 from me to buy flowers. You manipulated my compassion to fund a party." Brittany let out a loud, ragged sob, looking desperately toward Patricia and William for help, but her parents were thoroughly paralyzed by their own impending ruin. They could offer no shelter from the storm they had created. But what is infinitely worse than the theft, Malik continued, stepping closer to Brittany and forcing her to hold his intense gaze, is what you were willing to do to your own sister to protect your lies. He gestured toward me without taking his eyes off his bride. "I listened to you for months, telling me that Clara was a toxic, dangerous addict. You convinced my family that she was a threat to our safety. You used her as a shield to hide your own financial incompetence and your parents' bankruptcy. You were completely willing to let her face felony charges, lose her career, and go to prison just so you could maintain the illusion that you carry a designer handbag. You watched your mother forge legal documents to ruin her life, and you stood by and cheered. You are not a victim, Brittany. You are a predator." The absolute disgust in his voice was palpable. Malik was a man who valued loyalty and protection above all else. He had grown up in a household where family was sacred, where siblings guarded each other against the world. Witnessing a woman actively participate in the attempted destruction of her own flesh and blood fundamentally broke whatever bond he had felt toward her. He saw the ugly, rotting core hiding beneath the imported French lace and the expensive makeup. He saw a woman, devoid of empathy, utterly consumed by greed and superficial status. He realized in that agonizing moment just how dangerously close he had come to permanently binding his life and his reputation to a clan of professional parasites. Malik slowly turned away from Brittany and shifted his formidable attention to Patricia and William. My parents actually cowered under his gaze, physically sinking deeper into the velvet cushions of their sofa. Dr. Warren Thornton and Sylvia stood up, moving to stand directly behind their son in a powerful show of silent, unified support. The Thornton family presented a wall of authentic dignity that made the fake opulence of my parents' living room feel incredibly cheap and dirty. "You invited us into your home under the guise of joining two respectable families," Malik said to my parents, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "You sat at my dinner table, you drank my family's wine, and you looked my parents in the face, while you actively orchestrated a criminal extortion plot against your own daughter. You used my name and my family's social standing as the justification for your financial crimes. You thought you could wrap your toxic behavior in a nice package and we would just blindly accept it." Patricia tried to open her mouth, perhaps to offer one final desperate apology or another pathetic excuse. But the sheer force of Malik's glare shut her down instantly. She closed her mouth, trembling under the weight of his absolute judgment. "My family built our legacy on integrity and hard work," Malik declared, delivering the final crushing verdict to the people who had tried to play him for a fool. "You built yours on lies and the abuse of your own daughter." Malik did not wait for a response. He raised his left hand, his long fingers wrapping around the thick gold band resting on his ring finger. The movement was slow, deliberate, and entirely devoid of hesitation. Brittany let out a strangled gasp, her hands reaching out to stop him, but she was frozen in place by the sheer gravity of what was happening. Malik pulled the ring free. He did not throw it in anger. He did not toss it in disgust. He stepped forward and placed the gold band directly onto the center of the glass coffee table. It landed with a sharp, heavy clink right on top of the forged venue contract, a physical anchor weighing down the fraudulent documents that had exposed this entire nightmare. "We have not filed the marriage certificate with the county clerk yet," Malik stated, his voice echoing through the silent living room with absolute legal finality. The ceremony was purely symbolic until that paperwork was submitted. "As of this exact moment, this relationship is annulled. Do not contact me. Do not contact my family. My attorney will handle any outstanding logistical ties by the end of the business day tomorrow." Brittany collapsed. Her legs simply gave out beneath her. She crashed onto the expensive Persian rug, her hands gripping the fabric of her least designer skirt. A raw, guttural scream tore from her throat, the sound of a woman watching her entire fabricated universe vaporize into nothing. She clawed at the carpet, sobbing hysterically, begging Malik to wait, begging him to listen to some fabricated explanation that could somehow erase the undeniable proof of her betrayal. She pleaded for a second chance, her voice breaking as she promised to change, promised to leave my parents behind, promised whatever she thought Malik wanted to hear. But Malik had already turned his back on her. He offered no comfort. He offered no second chances. A man of his integrity could never build a life on a foundation of such profound deception. Dr. Warren Thornton and Sylvia adjusted their coats, their faces set in expressions of quiet, dignified exit. They did not spare a single glance for my weeping sister on the floor or my parents cowering on the velvet sofa. They simply turned and walked toward the grand entryway, eager to scrub the toxicity of this household from their lives completely. Before following his parents out of the sunken living room, Malik stopped. He turned his body completely away from the wreckage of his former bride and faced me. The anger and disgust that had hardened his features just moments ago softened into an expression of profound, deeply felt respect. He looked at me, not as the broken scapegoat my family had tried to portray, but as a survivor who had weathered an unimaginable storm of emotional abuse. "I am extremely sorry you were born into this," Malik said softly, his deep voice carrying a genuine weight of sympathy. "You deserve much better than the people in this room." "Thank you, Malik," I replied, holding his gaze with equal respect. "I wish you and your family the absolute best." He gave me a single firm nod. He turned on his heel, walked out of the living room, and strode down the hallway. Seconds later, the heavy wooden front door slammed shut. The sound reverberated through the massive house like a thunderclap, signaling the absolute end of the illusion. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the pathetic heaving sobs coming from Brittany. She lay curled in a fetal position on the rug, her perfectly styled hair falling in messy strands across her tear-stained face. She pounded her fists against the floor, wailing about her ruined life, her lost status, and the sheer humiliation she was about to face when her social circle discovered she had been dumped 3 days after her lavish wedding. William stared blankly at the glass coffee table, his eyes fixed on the gold wedding band resting atop the forged contract. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire life savings burn to ash. His shoulders sagged, his chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked breaths. He had no more bluster. He had no more bullying authority. He was just a broke, desperate man facing felony charges and absolute financial ruin. And then there was Patricia. My mother slowly lowered her hands from her face. She looked at the closed front door, then at her sobbing youngest daughter, and finally, her eyes locked onto me. I watched the gears turning violently in her head. She was rapidly calculating the damage. Malik was gone. The Thornton family wealth was gone. The social prestige she had craved was completely annihilated. Her house was actively in pre-foreclosure. The local police financial crimes unit was currently on standby, ready to execute an arrest warrant for felony grand theft and identity theft. She had absolutely nothing left, except for me. The realization hit her with the force of a freight train. The daughter she had relentlessly mocked, the child she had abandoned. The woman she had tried to extort was actually the chief executive officer of a multi-billion-dollar hospitality empire. I was the sole proprietor of the company she had defrauded. I was the only human being on the planet who possessed the financial resources to save her from living on the streets and the legal authority to stop her from going to a state penitentiary. Patricia slid off the velvet sofa. Her knees hit the floor with a heavy thud. She did not stand up. She crawled. The woman who had spent 34 years demanding perfection, who had constantly belittled my practical clothes and my quiet ambition, crawled across the expensive rug toward my feet. Her counterfeit designer handbag lay discarded and forgotten on the console table behind her. Clara. Patricia wept, her hands reaching out to grasp the hem of my tailored slacks. I took a swift, deliberate step backward, refusing to let her touch me. Her hands fell empty to the floor, grasping at the air. Please, Clara. My mother begged, looking up at me with wide, terrified eyes. You have to help us. You are rich. You are so incredibly wealthy. You own the entire resort. $45,000 is nothing to you. It is pocket change. You can pay the venue bill. You can make the lawsuit disappear. You can pay off the mortgage so we do not lose the house. She clasped her hands together in front of her chest, a pathetic picture of desperate submission. We are your family, Clara. You cannot let me go to jail. You cannot let your father end up on the street. I am so sorry for everything I said. I was stressed. I was panicked about the wedding costs. I was not thinking clearly when I signed your name. I am your mother. You have to forgive me. Please, I am begging you to save us. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the woman kneeling on the floor. I felt no triumph in seeing her reduced to this state. I felt no joy in watching my family completely disintegrate. I simply felt an overwhelming sense of finality. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been permanently destroyed and rebuilt entirely on my terms. Patricia was no longer demanding. She was groveling, praying that the lifelong conditioning she had instilled in me would somehow activate and force me to rescue her one last time. She was betting her freedom on the hope that I still desperately wanted her love. But that version of me no longer existed. I looked from Patricia's tear-streaked face to William's defeated posture. I looked at Brittany, who had stopped wailing just long enough to look up at me with a glimmer of desperate, pathetic hope in her red eyes. They were all waiting for me to pull out my checkbook. They were all expecting the reliable, responsible scapegoat to clean up their catastrophic mess. The sheer audacity of their expectation was breathtaking, a testament to decades of unchecked narcissism. You want me to save you? I stated, my voice echoing in the large room, cold and flat. You want me to wave a magic wand and erase the consequences of your own criminal actions? Yes, Patricia cried out, nodding eagerly, thinking she had found a sliver of mercy. Yes, please, Clara. We will do anything. We will be better. We are your family. I tightened my grip on the handle of my briefcase. I looked down at her one last time, ensuring she saw the absolute impenetrable ice in my gaze. The time for begging had expired long before she ever forged my name. Patricia's voice cracked, shattering the brief silence that had settled over the room. Clara, you are rich, she wailed, her hands clasping together in a posture of desperate prayer. You can pay the $45,000 without even noticing it is gone. You can save this house. You have the power to fix all of this right now. We are your family. I looked down at her. The woman who had spent my entire life making me feel incredibly small was now physically shrinking before my eyes. She knelt on the expensive rug she could not afford, begging for the financial salvation she believed she was inherently owed. I searched my own heart for any lingering trace of sympathy, any small spark of a daughter's love that might urge me to extend my hand and pull her up. I found absolutely nothing. The reservoir was completely dry. Family, I repeated. I let the word roll off my tongue. It tasted like ash. I looked at William, who was staring at the floor, unable to meet my gaze. I looked at Brittany, who was still trembling on the rug. Her ruined wedding dress pooled around her like a deflated parachute. Do not use that word, I said, my voice eerily calm and devoid of any warmth. You do not get to use that word to manipulate me anymore. Patricia gasped, her chest heaving as she struggled to breathe through her panic. But I am your mother. You lost the right to call yourself that a long time ago, I countered, taking a deliberate step away from her kneeling form. Let us talk about family, Mom. Family means protection. Family means showing up for each other when things get difficult. Family does not steal their daughter's social security number while she is sitting in a hospital waiting room trying to consolidate their medical debts. Family does not forge signatures to fund a fake, luxurious lifestyle just to impress strangers. I swept my gaze across the living room, taking in the cheap, leased reality they had tried so hard to protect. I wanted them to understand exactly why this bridge was being permanently burned. Just 3 days ago, I flew 10 exhausting hours across the Atlantic Ocean. I continued, my words striking like hammer blows in the quiet room. I brought a custom gift. I came to celebrate my sister. I stood at the gates of a resort that I bought, a resort I rebuilt with my own money, and I waited for my parents to welcome me. Patricia squeezed her eyes shut, fresh tears spilling over her mascara-stained cheeks. Please, Clara, we were wrong. We made a terrible mistake. You marched out of those grand doors, I said, ignoring her pathetic apologies completely. You looked me dead in the eye. You saw how exhausted I was. You saw the gift in my hands. And you sneered at me. You told me that my life was a mediocre failure. You told me I was socially unfit to mingle with the wealthy people you were trying to impress. William finally looked up, his face, a portrait of utter defeat. Clara, we were just trying to protect Brittany's new marriage. We were under so much pressure. You were protecting a lie, I snapped back, shutting him down instantly with the sharp edge of my voice. And you used me as the sacrifice. You told me verbatim that only family was allowed inside those gates. You looked at your own daughter and told her she was not invited. You told me to leave. I paused, letting the devastating weight of my next words gather in the heavy air. I looked directly into my mother's terrified, pleading eyes, ensuring she heard the absolute finality of my decision. You were right, Mom, I said with absolute unyielding conviction. Only family was allowed inside, and you are not my family. Patricia let out a guttural, heartbroken wail. She collapsed forward, her palms slapping against the floor. She finally realized that the emotional bridge between us had not just been burned. I had detonated the entire structure, and there was absolutely no way to rebuild it. She had pushed me away so forcefully that I had finally learned how to stand completely on my own. You cannot do this, Brittany whispered from the floor, her voice hoarse from screaming after Malik walked out. You cannot just leave us like this. The bank will take everything. We will be ruined. You already lost everything the moment you handed me that forged contract, I informed my sister coldly. I turned my attention back to the coffee table, looking down at the heavy legal dossier I had placed there earlier. I reached out and tapped the red cover with my index finger, shifting smoothly back into my corporate executive persona. You all seem to think I came here today to negotiate, I said, my tone brisk and entirely businesslike. You think this was a dramatic intervention where you could cry apologize and manipulate me into writing a massive check to save your pride? You severely misunderstand the situation. Patricia looked up, her face blotchy and desperate. What do you mean? I mean that Harrison did not just draft these papers to scare you, I explained with surgical precision. My legal team does not deal in empty threats or dramatic warnings. At exactly 9 o'clock this morning, the very moment the courthouse doors opened, my attorneys officially filed a civil lawsuit against you and Dad for the $45,000 venue debt, plus an additional $100,000 in punitive damages and corporate disruption costs. William choked on a gasp, his hands gripping his knees tight enough to turn his knuckles white. $145,000. We are already in pre-foreclosure. We do not have a single dime to our names. That is a problem you should have considered before you committed felony fraud against my corporation, I replied without a single ounce of empathy. My legal team has already filed injunctions to freeze whatever remaining credit lines you have left. We are going to seize every liquid asset you possess to satisfy this debt. Patricia scrambled to her knees, reaching out toward me again, her voice pitching into a hysterical shriek. Clara, no. The bank will take the house. We will be on the street. You cannot let your own parents become homeless over a piece of paper. It is not just a piece of paper, I corrected her, my voice dropping to a dangerous icy register. It is a forged financial guarantee carrying my personal identifying information, and as I told you over the phone yesterday, I am treating this with the exact severity it demands. I took a deliberate step back, positioning myself closer to the grand entryway. I looked at the three people who had made my life a miserable, anxious prison for over 3 decades. They looked pathetic, entirely stripped of their fake wealth and their unearned arrogance. The civil suit is just to ensure my company recovers its stolen funds, I stated, delivering the final devastating strike. But the civil suit is the absolute least of your concerns right now. Patricia froze, her breathing hitched in her throat, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape route that did not exist. What are you talking about? I told you I was not going to pay the bill, I said, my voice echoing off the high ceiling of the foyer. I also told you I was going to handle this strictly by the book. You committed a severe financial crime. You committed felony identity theft and grand theft. William stood up from the sofa, his legs shaking so violently he had to lean against the armrest to stay upright. Clara, what did you do? I did exactly what any responsible chief executive officer does when they discover a massive fraud scheme executed against their company. I replied, offering them one last chilling smile. I notified the authorities. The local police precinct received the full forensic dossier 2 hours ago, and they are not looking to negotiate. The silence following my declaration hung in the room for only a fraction of a second before a faint, piercing wail broke the quiet morning air. The sound started as a distant echo bouncing down the winding suburban streets of the affluent neighborhood. Within moments, the wailing grew exponentially louder, rapidly, multiplying and shifting into the unmistakable aggressive blare of approaching police sirens. William's head snapped toward the grand front windows. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving behind a stark, terrified mask. He slowly turned his gaze back to Patricia, his breathing shallow and rapid. The carefully constructed facade of the unified, loving patriarch shattered instantly. The fierce loyalty they pretended to share evaporated the second real consequences arrived at their doorstep. You told me it was a simple placeholder, William roared, his voice cracking with sheer panic. His hands curled into fists at his sides as he advanced on his wife, his posture hostile and accusing. You swore to me that using her information was completely safe. You said nobody would ever look at the signature. You promised me we would just transfer the debt after the wedding wrapped up. You forged a legal document and dragged me into a felony. Patricia backed away from him, her eyes wide with betrayal. Do not you dare put this all on me, she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger right back at his chest. You wanted to impress Malik's family just as much as I did. You were the one who insisted we book the premium open bar. You were the one who said we could not let those rich snobs think we were struggling. You knew exactly where that signature came from, and you did not say a single word to stop me when I handed it to the event coordinator. I am not going to prison for your stupid vanity, William bellowed, spittle flying from his lips. I will tell the detectives everything. I will tell them you orchestrated the entire scheme. Brittany scrambled to her feet, her ruined bridal gown tangling around her legs. She looked back and forth between her viciously arguing parents, her face twisted in a mixture of horror and selfish fury. You are both unbelievable, Brittany screamed, stomping her foot against the Persian rug like a spoiled toddler. You ruined my life. Malik is gone. He is annulling our marriage. My entire social circle is going to find out I am completely broke. You were supposed to secure my future, and instead you made me a laughingstock. I hate both of you. The living room devolved into a chaotic, feral battleground. The refined high society family that had so proudly mocked my sensible clothes and my quiet ambition was now tearing each other apart like cornered rats in a sinking ship. They hurled insults, traded blame, and completely abandoned any pretense of familial love. It was a spectacular, pathetic implosion of narcissism. The screaming match was violently cut short by a heavy, authoritative pounding on the solid oak front double doors. The impact rattled the expensive glass panes. Open up. Los Angeles Police Department. We have a warrant. The harsh, booming command from outside instantly paralyzed the room. The red and blue lights from the police cruisers flashed relentlessly through the sheer curtains, casting a frantic strobing glow across the expensive furniture and the pale faces of my family. Patricia let out a high, terrified squeak. She spun around, her eyes darting frantically toward the hallway leading to the back patio, clearly contemplating a completely futile escape. She took one panicked step toward the rear of the house, but another round of aggressive knocking echoed through the foyer. Open the door or we will breach it, the commanding voice yelled from the porch. William threw his hands up in the air in an immediate gesture of surrender, aggressively backing away from Patricia, as if her very proximity might infect him with her guilt. I walked calmly over to the heavy double doors, grasped the brass handles and pulled them wide open. 4 uniformed officers stood on the front porch accompanied by 2 plainclothes detectives wearing severe expressions and holding official clipboards. The lead detective, a tall man with a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped past me into the grand foyer. His sharp eyes scanned the living room, quickly identifying his targets. Patricia and William the detective asked, his voice projecting absolute authority. William immediately raised his hands higher. I did not sign it. He blurted out, his voice trembling with cowardice. She did it. She filled out the paperwork. I am fully willing to cooperate. Patricia let out a horrified gasp, staring at her husband with pure venom, before the detective stepped directly into her personal space. Patricia, you are under arrest for felony identity theft and grand theft in connection with the fraudulent execution of commercial contracts. Please turn around and place your hands behind your back. No, please, you do not understand, Patricia wailed, bursting into fresh hysterical tears as an officer grabbed her arms. This is a family dispute. My daughter is just angry with me. It was a massive misunderstanding. We were going to pay the money back. The officer ignored her desperate pleading entirely. He secured her wrists with a sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs. You have the right to remain silent. The officer recited, his voice completely devoid of emotion as he delivered the Miranda warning. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you by the state. Brittany collapsed back onto the sofa, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands as she watched her mother being physically restrained. William stood frozen against the far wall, thoroughly defeated, waiting for his own set of handcuffs as the second detective approached him with a stern warning about conspiracy to commit fraud. The officers guided Patricia out of the living room and propelled her toward the front door. I stepped aside, allowing them to escort the weeping, broken woman out onto the front porch. The morning sun was bright, illuminating the absolute humiliation of the scene. The flashing lights of the 3 squad cars parked in the cul-de-sac had drawn an enormous crowd. Neighbors were standing on their manicured lawns, clutching their morning coffees, openly staring at the spectacle. The wealthy, judgmental community that Patricia had spent years trying to impress was now watching her being marched down her own driveway in handcuffs, weeping like a common criminal. The loss of her precious social status was finally absolute and permanent. It was the ultimate devastating punishment for a woman whose entire existence revolved around projecting superiority and dominance over others. I stood in the foyer, the cool morning breeze washing over my face. I looked back into the living room one final time. William was quietly submitting to his arrest, his head bowed in deep, humiliating shame. Brittany was rocking back and forth on the velvet cushions, entirely consumed by the wreckage of her fraudulent life. The house felt incredibly cold, stripped of all its fake warmth and deceptive charm. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I did not shed a tear. I simply reached down, grabbed the sturdy leather handle of my custom briefcase, and picked it up. I stepped effortlessly over the invisible debris of their shattered lives, turned my back on the grand living room, and walked out the front doors into the brilliant California sunshine. I walked past the flashing police cruisers, past the whispering neighbors, and climbed into the back of my waiting private car. I never once looked back. I stepped away from Owen's embrace for a moment and walked back to the expansive glass overlooking the glittering grid of Los Angeles. People constantly preach that blood is thicker than water. Society conditions us from birth to believe that we owe our parents an unpayable debt simply because they brought us into the world. They tell us that we must forgive every transgression, excuse every cruelty, and absorb every betrayal, because at the end of the day, they are family. It is a dangerous, incredibly toxic mythology designed to keep victims chained forever to their abusers. For decades, I swallowed that mythology whole. I let my mother and father convince me that my boundaries were acts of profound selfishness. I allowed them to weaponize my empathy against me. When you are designated as the family scapegoat, you are actively trained to carry the weight of everyone else's failures. You are conditioned to believe that your sole purpose is to serve as the emotional and financial shock absorber for the golden child. You learn to make yourself incredibly small so their fragile, inflated egos can appear large to the outside world. But here is the absolute, undeniable truth about setting boundaries with deeply toxic people. The moment you stop playing by their rigged rules, they will accuse you of declaring war. When you refuse to hand over your hard-earned resources to fund their ridiculous delusions, they will immediately brand you a villain. You have to let them. Let them paint you as the ultimate antagonist in a story they completely fabricated. Your reputation in the minds of relentless manipulators is entirely worthless anyway. You cannot heal in the exact same environment that broke you, and you certainly cannot save people who are actively trying to drown you. Setting a firm boundary is not an act of aggression or malice. It is the ultimate act of radical self-love. It is building an impenetrable fortress around your peace of mind and refusing to lower the drawbridge for anyone who refuses to respect the moat. Many people believe that revenge requires active destruction. They think it requires screaming matches, drawn-out legal battles, and deliberate petty sabotage. But true devastating revenge is entirely silent. The absolute ultimate revenge is simply massive, unbothered success. It is waking up every single morning in a life that you designed from scratch, surrounded only by people who value your intellect and genuinely cherish your presence. My parents spent my entire life telling me I was a mediocre, embarrassing disappointment. They desperately needed me to be a failure so they could feel superior in their leased luxury cars and their heavily mortgaged mansion. By building a multi-billion-dollar corporate empire, I did not just prove them wrong. I completely invalidated their entire reality. I stripped away the very foundation of their arrogance without having to raise a single finger. I took my power back by simply refusing to participate in their miserable game. When you finally stop seeking validation from people who are fundamentally incapable of giving it, you reclaim an enormous amount of mental and emotional energy. I took every single ounce of that redirected energy and poured it directly into my corporation. I used the iron discipline I learned from surviving their daily emotional abuse and applied it to venture capitalism. I learned how to quickly spot a bad investment, whether it was a failing luxury resort or a highly toxic biological relationship. You must learn to cut your losses quickly and cleanly. You must learn to audit your personal life with the exact same ruthless precision you apply to a corporate balance sheet. If a relationship is operating at a massive deficit, constantly draining your joy, and returning nothing but manipulation and stress, you must liquidate that asset immediately and never look back. I turned away from the sprawling city lights and walked slowly back to the center of the massive boardroom. The polished obsidian table was clear, save for a single thick leather portfolio waiting patiently near my laptop. Owen walked over and gently opened it for me, flattening the crisp white pages. Inside lay the finalized acquisition contracts for a massive portfolio of high-end boutique hotels spanning the Mediterranean coast. It was the largest and most ambitious international buyout Apex Hospitality Group had ever attempted. A year ago, the sheer magnitude of this multi-million-dollar deal might have terrified me. The old Clara might have hesitated, hearing the nagging ghost of her mother's voice whispering that she was biting off more than she could chew, that she was destined to embarrass herself and fail completely. That toxic voice was completely permanently silent now. I picked up my favorite heavy silver pen, feeling its solid weight in my hand. I did not feel a single flicker of doubt or hesitation. I leaned over the dark wood table and signed my name on the dotted line with smooth, rapid, decisive strokes. My signature was bold, definitive, and entirely my own. No one could forge it, and no one could ever steal it again. It was a signature that commanded immense industry respect, moved millions of dollars across the globe, and secured the livelihoods of thousands of dedicated employees. It was the signature of a woman who had fought her way through absolute hell to claim her rightful throne. I closed the leather portfolio with a satisfying heavy thud that echoed nicely in the large room. I reached out and shut my laptop, the screen going dark, and signaling the absolute end of a highly productive workday. I looked up at Owen, returning his warm, incredibly proud smile. The sky outside the panoramic windows had shifted from bright, piercing gold to deep, vibrant shades of violet and crushed orange. The California sun was slowly sinking below the horizon, casting a spectacular, fiery glow over the mountains and the vast ocean beyond. The day was finally over, and tomorrow promised to be even brighter. I had weathered the worst storm of my life. I had faced the darkest, most deceptive parts of my past, and I had emerged entirely victorious. Sometimes the trash takes itself out, and sometimes you have to hand them the bill. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your peace and your future? Let me know your story in the comments. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe for more stories of surviving the unimaginable. The story of Clara's ultimate triumph over her family's deception serves as a powerful testament to one profound lesson: establishing firm boundaries with toxic relatives is not an act of malice, but the ultimate expression of radical self-love. Society often weaponizes the concept of family, conditioning us to believe that blood ties demand unconditional sacrifice. We are told to forgive endless transgressions and absorb relentless cruelty simply because they are family. However, Clara's journey vividly illustrates that when loyalty is abused for too long, it morphs into exploitation. True family is not defined by shared DNA, but by mutual respect, authentic support, and the fundamental desire to see each other thrive. When Patricia and William attempted to extort their own daughter to fund an illusion of grandeur, they proved that toxic people view relationships purely as transactional assets. Clara's decision to cut them off entirely, highlights the reality that you cannot heal in the exact same environment that continually tries to break you. Walking away from those who actively try to drown you is not a failure of forgiveness. It is an absolute necessity for survival. Furthermore, the narrative beautifully redefines the concept of revenge. Clara did not seek petty vengeance or chaotic retaliation. Instead, she achieved absolute unbothered success. By stripping away the emotional power her abusers held and channeling that energy into building her own empire, she invalidated their entire reality. It takes immense courage to look at the people who raised you and decide that your peace of mind is worth more than their conditional approval. By severing the anchor of their crushing expectations, you open yourself up to the limitless potential of a life built entirely on your own terms.